Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. That evening, she finally asked the question I had been waiting for. Her voice was sharp but trembling, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. She said, "Why haven't you touched me in a week?" I looked at her, calm and steady, and replied, "I'm preparing for life as a bachelor." The silence that followed hit harder than any argument ever could. Her face froze, the smirk she often wore replaced by something closer to fear. The truth was simple. I had already been living without her long before I stopped reaching for her. Nights of rejection had built walls between us higher than words could climb. Excuses about being tired, about being busy, about not being in the mood, had become her nightly shield. And I had grown tired of fighting battles she had already decided to lose. So I stopped trying. I stopped touching. And in that week of silence, I found something she never expected: peace. Earlier that day, I had gone to the gym after work, letting the sweat burn off the weight of years spent begging for affection. When I came home, she was waiting in the kitchen, scrolling on her iPhone with a glass of wine beside her. She didn't look up until I set my keys down. She smiled faintly, maybe out of habit, maybe out of guilt, and that was when the question slipped out of her mouth. She thought she could guilt me into breaking, thought I would stumble into an apology or a desperate excuse. Instead, I gave her the truth. After I said it, I walked past her without another word, upstairs to shower. Behind me, I could hear her shifting, restless, her glass clinking against the counter as her hand shook. She wasn't used to being on the other side of distance. She had always been the one to withdraw, the one to dictate when closeness was allowed. Now the silence belonged to me, and she didn't know how to survive it. That night, lying in bed, she turned toward me, her body tense, searching for some crack in my wall. But I stayed still, calm, breathing evenly, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. She whispered my name once, soft and uncertain. I didn't answer. I didn't move. She eventually rolled away, clutching her phone, scrolling through distractions that couldn't compete with the truth sitting next to her in silence. I wasn't pulling away to punish her. I was pulling away to prepare. And the preparation had already begun. The next morning, she moved through the house as if nothing had happened. She brewed coffee, hummed to herself, even asked if I wanted breakfast. But I could feel the tension bleeding through every forced gesture. She was waiting for me to crack, waiting for me to apologize for the sentence that had cut her deeper than any argument. "I'm preparing for life as a bachelor." I didn't flinch. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and scrolled through my phone. She asked how I slept. I said fine. She asked if I was working late. I answered, maybe. Short, detached, final. The silence in between swallowed her whole. She hated it. For years, I had been the one filling those silences, explaining myself, begging for closeness. Now she was left to sit in them, drowning in the emptiness she had once created. At work, I started setting new routines. I stayed later at the office, lifting the weight of responsibility off my chest by burying myself in tasks. At lunch, I met with an attorney, just to understand my options. The meeting was calm, professional, but every detail added strength to my resolve. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't powerless. The path out was clear, and the first steps had already been taken. When I came home that evening, she was waiting in the living room, dressed like she had somewhere to be, makeup done carefully. She asked if I wanted to go out to dinner, maybe Olive Garden like we used to. I told her I'd already eaten. The look on her face shifted, disappointment, confusion, panic flickering all at once. She tried to laugh it off, tried to act like it didn't matter, but the silence that followed crushed her performance. Later that night, when I climbed into bed, she slid closer, her hand brushing against my arm, tentative, testing. I stayed still, neither rejecting nor accepting. She whispered that she missed me. I didn't answer. I didn't move. She shifted away after a long pause, clutching her pillow like it could replace the connection she had spent years denying me. In that quiet, I realized something. I didn't need to confront her, didn't need to shout, didn't need to explain. The distance itself was the message. And the more she tried to pull me back, the more she would see the truth. I wasn't preparing for life as a bachelor. I was already living it. By midweek, she started unraveling. The performance of normalcy slipped, and desperation seeped through every word. She followed me around the house, asking if I was upset, if I was seeing someone else, if I was serious about what I said. Each time, I gave her the same answer, silence, or a calm, "I'm fine." It wasn't the response she wanted, and that was exactly the point. She had grown comfortable with control. For years, she had dictated when affection was allowed, when intimacy was rationed, when I was permitted to feel wanted. And I had accepted it, hoping things would change, hoping she would wake up to what she was losing. But now the rules were different. Now I was the one holding the line, and she had no idea how to break it. That Thursday evening, she tried again. She came home with takeout from Chick-fil-A, placed the bags on the table, and told me she thought we could have a date night at home. I sat, ate quietly, and thanked her when I finished. Nothing more. She stared at me across the table, waiting for me to add something, to bridge the silence. I didn't. I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it, and walked away. Her voice trembled as she called after me, asking if I even cared anymore. I didn't answer. Later that night, I opened my laptop and began researching apartments. Studio, one bedroom, furnished or not, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had options, and every photo I scrolled through felt like another inch of space between us. She noticed the glow of the screen, asked what I was looking at. I closed the laptop calmly and told her, "Just planning ahead." Her face went pale. That weekend, I packed a few boxes, nothing obvious, just enough to test how far I could move without her noticing. Important documents, clothes I actually wore, a few books. I drove them to a storage unit and locked the door behind me. It felt final in a way that words never could. When I came home, she was waiting in the living room, her phone in her hand, tears streaking her face. She asked if I was leaving her. I told her calmly, "I already started." Then I walked upstairs, leaving her alone in the quiet she had once used against me. And as I lay in bed, I realized the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like freedom. The following days were a slow collapse she couldn't hide. She lingered in doorways, tried to start conversations about meaningless things, weather, groceries, what to watch on Netflix. I gave her polite, detached replies, but never opened the door she was desperate to step through. The same silence she once weaponized now surrounded her, and I could see her drowning in it. One evening, I came home later than usual. She had set the table for two, candles lit, pasta steaming, wine poured. It looked like something from the early days of our marriage, but the cracks showed in the details, the overcooked food, the forced smile, the way her hands trembled when she held her glass. I sat, ate quietly, and thanked her when I finished. She asked if we could talk. I stood, carried my plate to the sink, and told her, "There's nothing left to say." Then I walked upstairs, leaving her alone with her carefully staged illusion. That night, she slid into bed wearing lingerie I hadn't seen in years. Her hand brushed against me, tentative, testing. I stayed still. She whispered my name, trying to draw me back into the cycle. I didn't move. After a long pause, she rolled over, her phone lighting her face as she scrolled through distractions until her eyes watered. The silence between us had become the loudest truth of all. Meanwhile, I was moving faster. I sold things online, transferred money, and spent evenings at the storage unit, building a life separate from hers piece by piece. Each step was quiet, deliberate, impossible to reverse. She thought she still had time to fix things. She didn't realize the foundation was already gone. By the weekend, she cracked. She stood in the kitchen with tears in her eyes, asking why I was shutting her out, asking if I even wanted her anymore. I told her calmly, "I wanted you when it mattered. You didn't." Then I walked past her, out the door, and into the night air that felt cleaner than anything inside that house. I drove aimlessly, stopping at a Waffle House for coffee and eggs, sitting alone at the counter while strangers laughed and talked around me. It was simple, quiet, and real. More real than anything waiting back home. And in that moment, I realized something. She was still fighting for control, but the truth was undeniable. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was already gone. The silence between us had turned into something she couldn't bear. She filled every room with noise. Music playing in the background, the TV blaring shows she wasn't watching, her voice chasing me with questions I never answered. But it didn't matter how loud she tried to make the house. The silence wasn't outside. It was inside me. One morning, she followed me into the kitchen as I poured coffee. She asked why I was acting like a stranger, why I couldn't just talk to her. I told her flatly, You made me a stranger long before I stopped talking. Her face twisted, but she couldn't find words to fire back. I walked out the door, leaving her standing there with her mug clutched so tightly I thought it might break. At work, I stayed later than usual, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The office was quiet, empty, but even that silence felt lighter than the one at home. On my way back, I stopped at Target, bought new clothes, toiletries, and a few things I would need for the apartment I hadn't signed for yet, but already knew was coming. Each purchase was another step away from her world, another reminder that I didn't belong in hers anymore. That night, she tried again. She had friends over, laughing too loudly, pouring wine like nothing was wrong. But I caught the way their eyes followed me when I walked through the living room, the questions behind their polite smiles. They knew. Even if she hadn't told them the truth, they could feel it. Respect doesn't die quietly. It leaves a trail everyone can see. After they left, she cornered me in the hallway. She said we couldn't keep going like this. I told her calmly, we already stopped. Her breath hitched, her hands trembling at her sides, but I didn't stay to watch her crumble. I went upstairs, shut the door, and let the silence take care of the rest. That weekend, I loaded more boxes into my truck and drove them to the storage unit. Each trip felt like peeling another layer of myself out of the life she thought was permanent. By the time I locked the unit, the truth was undeniable. She was still fighting for a version of us that no longer existed. And me? I was no longer preparing for life as a bachelor. I was already living it. By then, she had run out of tactics. The laughter, the dinners, the lingerie, the staged attempts at intimacy, all of it had collapsed into raw panic. She hovered near me like a shadow, asking if we could go away for the weekend, if we could take a trip, start fresh. I told her calmly, trips don't fix what's already dead. Then I grabbed my keys and left her standing in the doorway. I drove with no destination, the windows down, the night air washing over me. I stopped at a small diner off the highway, sat at the counter, and ate in peace while the world moved around me. It was simple, honest, and real. No stage performances, no forced smiles. Just me and the freedom I had already claimed. When I came home, she was waiting again, this time sitting on the porch, her phone clutched in her hands. She asked where I'd been. I told her out. Nothing more. She pressed, her voice rising, demanding answers. I looked at her calmly and said, you used to reject me for weeks without explanation. Now you know what it feels like. Then I walked past her into the house, leaving her shaking with rage and fear. The next morning, I moved faster. I met with the realtor, finalized the details, and saw the first apartment in person. The walls were bare, the floors plain, but to me it looked like freedom. I signed the lease the same day. By the time she realized what was happening, it would already be too late. That evening, she tried to corner me again. She said we couldn't throw away years of marriage over a rough patch. I told her flatly, you don't get to call it a rough patch after years of disrespect. Her face drained of color. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. She just stood there in silence while I walked upstairs, leaving her rooted in the wreckage of her own choices. That night, I packed another suitcase, loaded it into my truck, and drove it to the apartment. The space was still empty, but it already felt more like home than the house I had just left. I sat on the floor, ate takeout straight from the bag, and let the silence settle around me. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It healed. The shift was no longer subtle. She could feel it, see it, sense it in the way I carried myself. For years, she had treated my presence as guaranteed. Now every step I took out the door left her more uncertain, more desperate. She called me at work 3 times in one afternoon, her voice frantic, asking if I was coming home early, asking if we could talk. I told her calmly, I'll be home when I'm home. Then I hung up. When I finally returned that evening, the house was too quiet. She was sitting in the living room, her eyes red, tissues scattered on the coffee table. She asked if I still loved her. I looked at her evenly and said, I loved you when you pushed me away. That love's gone. Her shoulders collapsed, and she turned her face into her hands. I walked past her without stopping. That weekend, I didn't spend a single night at the house. I stayed at the apartment instead, sleeping on a bare mattress, eating pizza out of the box, and feeling more alive than I had in years. The silence there was different, clean, calm, not heavy with rejection or hostility. For the first time in a long time, Silence wasn't a punishment. It was peace. On Sunday evening, I stopped by the house to pick up more of my things. She was waiting again, pacing, trying to look composed. She asked if we could go to counseling. I told her, counseling doesn't rebuild respect, and that's gone. Her face twisted, and she shouted that I was throwing everything away. I didn't shout back. I simply carried my boxes to the truck and drove off. The next morning, she tried another tactic, guilt. She sent long texts about memories, about how we had built a life together, about how people would see me if I left. I read every word and responded with nothing. The silence itself was my reply, and it was louder than anything I could have typed. By midweek, she was unraveling in front of everyone else. A friend of hers stopped me in the grocery store, asking if we were okay. I smiled politely and said, "We're fine." But my calm tone told a different story. Word was already spreading, and she couldn't control it. The truth was simple. She had trained me to live without her. Now she was learning what that really meant. By now, the house felt less like mine and more like a stage where she rehearsed her desperation. Every time I stopped by, I could see the fear in her eyes. She had started dressing up even when she had nowhere to go, cooking meals she barely touched, trying to look like the woman she thought I wanted years ago. But none of it mattered anymore. I didn't need costumes or empty gestures. I needed respect. That Friday, I stopped in to grab more of my clothes. She blocked the doorway, asking if we could at least have dinner together, just one night. I looked at her calmly and said, "Dinner won't change the silence you gave me for years." She stepped aside, defeated, and I carried my bags past her without another word. At the apartment, I unpacked slowly, hanging shirts in the closet, stacking books on the shelf, building a life she wasn't part of. The space was small, but it was mine. No games, no cold shoulders, no hidden punishments. Just freedom. I ordered takeout, sat on the couch, and watched the night settle outside my window. For the first time in years, I felt at home. Over the weekend, she tried a new angle. She posted pictures on Facebook, smiling selfies, old vacation shots, captions about loving life and new beginnings. But people who knew us weren't fooled. Friends started reaching out to me, asking if everything was all right. I told them the truth in as few words as possible. "We're done." That silence afterwards spoke louder than any explanation could. By Sunday night, she cracked again. She called me 10 times in a row. When I finally answered, her voice was broken, demanding to know where I was, if I was with someone else. I told her, "I'm where I should have been years ago, on my own." Then I hung up and blocked her number. The next morning, I met with my lawyer to finalize the paperwork. It was clean, professional, inevitable. By the time she realized what was happening, the process would already be in motion. No fights, no drama, no last-minute rescues. Just the cold reality she had built herself. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I ever had. She had spent years teaching me how to live without love. Now I was teaching her what it meant when I finally listened. By the time she realized what was happening, the divorce papers were already drafted. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn her. I let the silence carry the message. One evening, I stopped by the house to collect the last of my things. She was waiting in the kitchen, her face pale, her hands gripping the counter like she needed it to stay upright. She asked if this was really the end. I told her calmly, "It ended a long time ago. This is just the paperwork." Then I walked upstairs without waiting for her reply. She followed me, her voice breaking, asking if we could try again, if I could just give her one more chance. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I packed the last box, closed it, and carried it past her. Every step down the stairs was another nail in the coffin she had built herself. That weekend, I moved the final pieces into the apartment. The space was full now. Clothes hung, shelves lined, photos framed. But none of the photos included her. I erased her presence with the same precision she had erased my worth. The difference was, I wasn't bitter. I was free. Meanwhile, her world began to shrink. Friends who once filled her weekends stopped coming around. They had seen enough, heard enough, to know the truth. Family members reached out to me quietly, saying they understood. Respect is hard to fake, and hers had evaporated long before I walked out. She tried one last play. She showed up at my apartment late at night, tears streaming, her voice raw as she begged me to listen. I opened the door, looked her in the eye, and told her, "I don't live in the past, and you don't live here." Then I closed the door, leaving her in the hallway, alone with the echo of her own choices. Inside, I sat back on the couch and let the silence settle again. This time it wasn't just peace, it was finality. The line was drawn, the bridge burned, the chapter closed. She had expected me to rage, to fight, to plead. Instead, I had done the one thing she couldn't survive. I left her in the silence. And in that silence, everything she had thrown away finally spoke back. The final stage wasn't loud. It wasn't a fight or a breakdown. It was quiet, deliberate, irreversible. The papers went through, the signatures dried, and the marriage that had once defined my life dissolved into nothing more than a memory filed in a cabinet. She tried to call, but the number was blocked. She sent messages, but they bounced back into silence. Her access to my world was gone, and with it, her ability to hurt me. I changed the locks on the house I no longer needed, cleared the bank accounts, and closed every joint credit card. There were no loopholes, no lingering ties. She had spent years rationing out affection like it was charity, and now she would learn what it meant to live without my devotion, without my protection. I moved fully into the apartment, and with each day, the place felt more alive. I bought a new couch, hung new curtains, filled the fridge with food that was mine alone. I even bought a Ford F-150, parked it in the lot, and looked at it like a symbol of the life I had rebuilt from the ground up. Freedom on 4 wheels, waiting for the next chapter. Meanwhile, her life unraveled in ways I didn't have to witness. Friends whispered, family distanced, and the image she had once tried to project cracked under the weight of reality. People began to see through the facade, and she was left standing in the ruins, with nothing but silence where my voice used to be. The last time I saw her was in passing, weeks after everything was finalized. She looked smaller, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up. She tried to speak, but I simply nodded once, walked past, and never looked back. That was the closure, not a conversation, not an argument, just the quiet end of a story that no longer belonged to me. Back at my apartment, I poured a glass of bourbon, sat on the balcony, and let the night stretch around me. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a companion, a reminder that I had chosen myself over the slow death of being ignored. She once asked why I hadn't touched her for a week. The truth was simple. I was preparing for life as a bachelor. And now, that life had already begun. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.